Discover the power of Photoshop 4.0 with Photoshop Essentials. Digital artist and professional instructor Katrine Eisman takes you through a wide variety of tips, tricks, and special projects for creating amazing digital imagery. Learn setup procedures for maximum efficiency, selection techniques for precise layering, easy one-step color and density correction, color adjustments and effects with levels and curves, time-saving keyboard shortcuts, and incredible special effects. Invaluable creative tools for getting the most out of Photoshop 4.0. Photoshop Creative Compositing offers professional techniques for creating multidimensional digital imagery. Through step-by-step instruction, Katrine Eisman provides valuable insight to Photoshop's powerful layering capabilities. Master the use of channel and layer masks for seamless image blending. Learn selective matting techniques, clipping group applications, compositing techniques for maximum flexibility, advanced selection tools, and time-saving tips. A wide variety of techniques that will quickly and easily speed your work and add to your creative edge. Plugin Power 1 features the plugin capabilities of Lightwave 3D with Macroform, Particle Storm, and Wave Filter. New Tech's own Brad Peebler shows you how to quickly master the natural modeling qualities of Macroform's Rail tools and productivity toolset. Learn to create complex organic models using simple spline shapes. Use precision scaling and alignment tools to speed your modeling productivity. With Particle Storm, learn how to create cascading water, roaring fire, and showers of sparks. See how to control density, gravity, collision, lifespan, and other characteristics to give your animation lifelike qualities with this incisive particle system package. Learn how to selectively apply filters to Lightwave imagery with Wave Filter. Colorize, posterize, blur, color filter effects, and more. Discover Wave Filter's unique mixing board interface that enables you to animate any of these effects over time. Master these powerful plugins with Plugin Power 1. Learn to quickly create light beams, variable density fog, dust, and smoke with Lightwave Steamer, the powerful pixel filter and particle displacement map plugin. This in-depth view of Steamer shows you how to master its powerful controls. Create ray-traced light beams. Add atmospheric simulation with variable density clouds and fog. Discover how to use Steamer with objects to create dust clouds, billowing steam, and animated smoke trails. Learn to master Steamer's attributes and settings for speed and efficiency. Organic modeling and animation takes you through essential steps for creating realistic creature animation. Learn powerful modeling techniques to quickly model your creature from a simple sketch. Digital artist David Lombardi demonstrates modeling techniques for optimum animations. Learn the capabilities of Puppet Master for natural body movement. Add facial expression using multiple morph targets controlled with Lightwave's Morph Gizmo. Then create the walk sequence, incorporating Lightwave's inverse kinematics capabilities. Discover how to set up and combine these features for maximum effect and realism. All this and more, available now from Desktop Images. Dear video professional, the elements of this videotape represent the work of creative professionals like yourself. Unauthorized duplication of this tape not only is a federal crime, but also contributes to the destruction of an industry that you helped create. Please do your part by not duplicating this videotape. Thank you. A special note for Macintosh users. For any functions mentioned using the right mouse button, hold down the Apple key and click the mouse. Are you suffering from unwelcomed house guests? Are flies vomiting on your food? Finding roaches in your shoes? Then get new Bug Off. You try to get rid of them, but sprays don't work. Aerosols make you gag. Only Bug Off employs an exclusive miniaturized weapon system to seek out and eliminate household pests with surgical precision. Bug Off comes complete with sub-miniature projectile laser-assisted technology. that kills bugs on contact. No roach motels here. Pesky ants just can't hide from Bug-Off's maximized environment shielding system. And those annoying flies. They're just no match for Bug-Off's flying insect roaming eliminator. %50 stronger than sprays. So get Bug-Off today.
Hi, I'm Don Balance. This tape is the second in a series designed to give you all the tools you need to become a Lightwave 3D animator. In this tape, we're going to take all the objects that we made in tape number 1 and bring them into the layout. The layout is our sound stage, and it's where we create our animations, it's where we surface our object, set up our lighting and our camera. We're going to talk about setting up the layout and changing the config file to optimize layout to run on your machine. We're also going to create a scene. We're going to do basic lighting and surfacing of the objects and create an animation from the first keyframe to the final output. We're using a 500 megahertz DEC Alpha workstation from Digital Equipment Corporation using a PowerStorm OpenGL card and 128 megs of RAM. Let's go ahead and take a look at layout. The layout is set up a lot like a soundstage. We have our camera, we have our light. We have these move gadgets up here. If I hold the left mouse button down over the top of them, I can move my view. I'm not moving the objects or the camera, I'm just moving the view. I can rotate around the scene, look at the environment that I'm working within. I can also zoom in and zoom out by using this key. I have several different views to choose from. Front view, top view, and side view are two-dimensional views. And then we have the perspective view, which is kind of a third-person view. It allows me to see the camera, the lights, any objects I would have loaded in the scene. And the camera view, the most important view, that's what's going to render. For now, I'll stay in the perspective view, and let's talk about setting Lightwave up before we actually bring objects into the scene. I'm going to go to the Options panel. In the Options panel, there are two tabs. One is General Options, and one is Layout View. First thing I want to talk about is in General Options, and it's the Content Directory. The Content Directory allows me to change where Lightwave goes to look for objects and images when you try to load a scene. It defaults to the directory that Lightwave was loaded into your machine on. But let's say I get a CD-ROM that's got some content on it, and I want to load from that. Well, if it's set to my content directory on my hard drive, and then I go and I look at the CD-ROM for my image, I'll load up this example. It will tell me that it can't find it because it's looking in C:\newtek objects directory for those objects, because that's where I told it to look by setting the content directory there. So I could say yes, and then I could go and find the objects on the CD one by one if I wanted to. Or the easier way is to change the content directory. If I go to the Options panel and I click on Content Directory, it allows me to select a new content directory. So I'll choose the CD. Now, when I try and load that same scene again, it loads right up for me with no problem. This is very helpful if you're trying to load scenes and objects from other media, like maybe a hard drive or a zip drive, a CD-ROM. It's also very useful for cross-platform. If I'm doing work on my Macintosh and then I want to bring it to my PC, those hard drives are more than likely, they have drastically different names. So I'm going to have to change my content directory so that I can find all the objects when I try and load a scene. It also works well on networks when people have different drive names across the network. They can all share the same scene just by changing their content directory, be able to load the scenes up easily. Let's go ahead and clear this scene out, take a look at a few more options in the Options panel. The Layout grid is this grid that represents my ground plane or my floor. It defaults to a 40 by 40 grid. This is used basically as a reference. You can see here that my axes come together, and this is just like my axes in the modeler. So if I model an object so that its center is on the center of all three crosshairs in the modeler, when I load it into Layout, it comes right to this point right here. This is 0, 0, 0. I can also use this as a way of measuring things. I can see my grid size is 1 meter down here. And if I go to my top view, looking down, I know that each one of these squares is now 1 meter. So it's a way to measure distance between objects or distance traveled of an object. I can set this grid all the way up to 100 by 100. just to give me a much larger grid to work with. And the grid size will change depending upon the object that you load in. It will change to accommodate the size of the object. If you remember from the quick start tape, when I load in the actual stars scene, which is a very, very large ball of stars, the grid goes really, really big. And if I would have loaded an original object like a spaceship first, I don't see the spaceship anymore, I just see the big ball of stars. I can go ahead and change the grid size back down to a small grid size and hit reset for the camera, which will bring the camera back to 0, 0, 0, and then move the camera back out to see the scene I was setting up with the stars already in place. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other options in the options panel. And this is where I can control my color shaded preview options. If I'm using Windows-based machines, it's OpenGL. If I'm using a Macintosh, it's QuickDraw 3D. And these modes allow me to see my objects in a color shaded preview. I have OpenGL turned off right now on my machine, so I will not get a color shaded preview. Let me load up an object. And I see the chair in wireframe. If I go to the options panel and I turn on Use OpenGL without the textures, I now see the color shaded preview. Now there are no textures on my chair right now, so even if I turn on Enable Textures, I don't see a difference. Unlike another object, with the space fighter, we can see the texture. There's an image map on the space fighter. So if we rotate it around, we can see the image in our color shaded preview. Let's take a look at how lights work with our color shaded previews. For OpenGL, I can set the number of OpenGL lights right here, and it can be a number from 0 to 8, 8 being the maximum amount of lights that OpenGL will use. I can have as many lights in the scene as I wish. I'll only see the effect of 8 of those lights through OpenGL. Okay, now I'm going to go and load a scene up. It's got some lights in it. What I have here is a little temple set up with an Easter Island guy here, and I have 3 lights in the scene. I have 3 point lights, and I can spin these lights, and as I spin them, we can see their effect in real time on the object, the white, purple, and yellow lights. If I go back to my options panel, I can see that OpenGL is set to use 3 lights. If I change this to 1, I now only see the effect of 1 of the lights. If I go back in and I change it to 2, I can see 2 of the lights, and so on. The maximum amount of lights that my solid shaded previews will display for me is 8 lights. But I can have as many lights in the scene as I wish. So you may ask yourself, why don't I just keep that number set to 8 all the time? Well, on my machine, if I have 8 lights in there, it's no problem because I have an OpenGL accelerator and my machine can handle displaying all 8 lights. But let's say I'm working on my laptop on an airplane. I might not be able to display all 8, or if I do display all 8, my display is just going to slow down to a crawl because I don't have any kind of OpenGL accelerator on my laptop. So it gives you the option to bump down the number of lights that it's going to use and display so that I can speed up a display on a machine that doesn't display the graphics fast enough. Also, which lights does it use? Well, it uses right in a row from the top of the scene down, the lights that you'd in. Light number 1, light number 2, and so on and so forth. So you may want to keep that in mind as you're loading lights into the scene because you may want to have certain lights displayed in OpenGL and other lights may not make that big of a difference. All right, let's talk about loading objects. We'll clear this scene out. And by the way, you clear a scene using the file pop-up here. This is also where I load and save scenes. To load an object, there are 3 different ways I can do that. I can either click on the Objects panel and click on Load Object, and it brings up my Load Object File Requester. Or I have a little pop-up button right here, and depending upon what edit is set to, if I'm editing objects, it allows me to load an object file, which brings up my requester again, or load a null object, add a null object to the scene. Or I can use the keyboard equivalent for loading an object, which is the plus key, which also brings up my requester to load an object. Let's go ahead and load an object. This is one of the objects that we made in the modeler. This is the table. It comes in so that the top of the table is resting on the ground plane. If I go to the side view, we can see here's the ground plane. The top of the table is actually underground. I also want you to notice that right in the center here is the pivot point. If I go back to my perspective view, you can see the pivot point there, and if I rotate the table, you'll notice that it rotates around that center point, That is our pivot point. I can undo the last move that I did in the layout. This helps out, but remember, you only get one level of undo in layout. Well, if I want the table to be laying on the ground or sitting on the ground properly, I can do this a couple of different ways. I can go to the modeler, and I can get the table. Now, in my face view here, I can see the x-axis is my ground plane. So if I move the table, if I hit the T key for move and hold down the control key to constrain, I can bring the table up so that it's resting on the ground plane. Now, if I put the table back over top of the old one, it's now sitting on the ground plane like I wanted it to be. And from this point on, it will load in if I resave this object sitting on the ground plane. You'll also notice that the pivot point now is at the bottom of the table. So if I rotate the table, it now rotates around the bottom of the table because that's where the pivot point is. I could have also moved it from within layout. Let's clear the scene and reload the object. In layout, I could go to my side view and move the table up so that it's resting on the ground plane. But you'll notice that when I do that, the pivot point is now still at the top of the table. So there may be a situation where I want the pivot point at the top of the table. This would make more sense. I can also have the option of moving the pivot point while I'm in layout. So I can move the pivot point down to the bottom center of the table here, and again, if I rotate the table now, it rotates around where that pivot point is. Let's go ahead and move that back up. Now, if I want the table to load in like this from now on after I've moved it up, I can save the object as a transformed object. If I go to the Objects panel, one of my options here is Save Transform, and it will allow me to save this object either over top of the old one, or I can create a new object name and keep both tables for future use. Okay, let's continue to set the scene up. We now have the table loaded in where we want it. I'm going to go to my camera view using my keyboard equivalent of 6, and I can see that the camera is down below here. So I want to go to Edit Camera because I want to move the camera, and I'm on Mouse Move. I can now move the camera up so I can see the table in a little bit more realistic fashion here. I'm going to back off a little bit because the next object I want to load is the room that the table is going to be sitting within. The room is nothing but a box that I made in the modeler, and then I turned all the polygons facing inward. How did I do that? Well, within the modeler, let's bring our table up so we can see how big it's going to be. And let's expand this view out. I'll grab the box object, make a box, go back to my quad view. I need to be able to give it some depth in the other windows. So let's say I want to make a room about this size. I make that box and I can see it from the outside. Now, if I select the polygons that make up that box, I can see that they're facing out because of the surface normals or pointing out in all directions. If I hit the F key on the keyboard, F for flip, it flips all those polygons so they're now facing inward. And I now have a room that I can put things inside because I can see those polygons this way. Okay, let's go ahead back over to layout. Let's load up our room object. And I can now see that the table is sitting inside the room and it's on the floor because when I made the room object, I made sure that the floor was resting on the ground plane. So now I'm going to take my camera, Edit Camera, and I'm going to move the camera in a little bit here. And one thing I want to show you is, if I go to my top view, see how big the camera and the light are in comparison to the table in the room? Well, this also has to do with my grid size. And right now, I can make really drastic camera moves with moving the mouse just a little ways. If I want to be able to make more subtle moves, I need to be able to change my grid size. And I need to make the grid size smaller. Right now, my grid size is set to 2 meters. I'm going to go ahead and set it to, let's say, 0.5 meters or 50 centimeters. Now, you can see that the camera is much smaller than it was before, and I can do a much more subtle move because I've shrunk my grid size. Let's go ahead and look through the camera view, and I'm going to move the camera around and rotate the camera down. Here I can see my table, and I'm going to move the camera over a little bit because I want to get the corner of the room into the shot. So I'm going to rotate this around so I can see the corner of the room and get the idea that I actually am in a room. Now at this point, if I want to do a test render just to see what this looks like, I can hit the F9 key, but before I do, I want to make sure that I have some kind of display option active. So I'll go back to the render panel, and there's two different settings I can use for showing my renderings. I can show the rendering in progress, and this will come up and tell me that this may result in longer rendering times. And if I'm actually rendering an animation, I don't want to use this feature because it's going to try and display each frame as it's rendering, and that takes up time. But if I'm in the test mode and I'm trying to do test frames and look at it, I can turn that on. I can hit F9, and F9 is going to render the current frame that I have displayed on my time slider here. Well, just frame 0 is fine. And I can see the render in progress, and then I get this small window view of what the rendering is going to look like. Now, if I want to get an actual size image, I go into the render panel, and I can turn on full size window. And with full size window set, I'll still see the rendering in progress as long as I still have it turned on, and I get a full-size image. Depending upon what the resolution of the camera is set to, it will actually display that pixel count for me on the screen in this image. I can also turn off Show Render in Progress and just keep full-size window on. This way, it doesn't have to display the rendering for me, and it renders faster, and I still end up with a full-size image at the end to look at to make sure that it looks okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn Show Render in Progress on so that we can see the renderings happening, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as the tape goes on. Okay, now let's go ahead and begin to set the table. I want to put the plate, I want to put knife, fork, spoon out, and set 4 place settings on my table. So first I'm going to start by loading the plate. Here's the plate, and when I load it, it loads into 0, 0 axis of layout, because when I modeled it at 0, 0 axis in the modeler. Now, I want to go ahead and parent the plate to the table. And what I mean by that is I'm going to set up a relationship between the table and the plate so that when I move the table, the plate moves with it. The plate is parented to the table. So I have the plate highlighted. I click on the parent button, and it brings me to a requester that has a pop-up menu that shows me all of the available objects in the scene. Well, I want to parent the plate to the table. When I click OK, notice that the plate moved. It snapped up to being on the table. Why? Because when you parent an object, I'm now changing the coordinates it's using. It's no longer using 0, 0, 0 axis coordinates in layout. It's using 0, 0, 0 axis of the table, which is the table's pivot point. You remember we had the pivot point right at the top of the center of the table? That's now where 0, 0, 0 for this plate is. So if I now grab the table as my object and move the table around, you'll notice that the plate moves with it. Now what happens if I move the table over here and I want to load up a second plate and put it on the table? Well, I load the plate. It loads into 0, 0, 0 here. And I say, oh, well, I want to move it onto the table. So I'll go to my side view, and I'll zoom in. I can also use move to move this, center it up a little bit, zoom in a little bit more. And I'm on Object Move, plate number 2. So I can take the plate and set it up on the table. There it is. Now I can go back to my camera view, keyboard shortcut of 6. And since I've already moved it on the y-axis, I don't want to move it up and down anymore. I can turn the y-axis off. Now I can only move on X and Z. And I can come over and I can set it down on the table. Oh, but I want to parent it to the table so it moves around like the other one does. So we go to the parent button. We select the table, and the plate disappears. Why? Because I moved the plate, and I moved the plate a certain distance from its 0, 0, 0 axis in layout. When I parented the plate to the table, it says, well, my 0, 0, 0 axis is now over here at the pivot point of the table. So when you moved me out here. So it's now done that same move, but I've changed its coordinates. I've changed it from the coordinates from within layout to the coordinates of the table. If I go to the top view and I zoom out, we can see that the plate is over here. If you remember, I moved the plate from here to here. Then when I parented it to the table, now this is 0, 0, so I actually moved the plate from here to here. Let's go back to our camera view, keyboard 6, and plate number 2, I'm just going to go ahead and clear it. I can just click on this button if I'm on Object Edit and I have this object selected. By clicking on Clear, I can clear that from the current scene. Now, I'm going to load that plate again But this time, if I parent it first before I move it, parent to the table, OK. Now it snaps right to where the other plate was, because I haven't moved it yet, so I now have two plates at 0, 0, 0 from the axis coordinates of the table. OK, so I've got two plates there. I'm going to go to my top view, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit, move over so I can see the table here. And I'm going to move my plates into position. So plate number 1, I'm on mouse move. We'll move this plate down to here. Plate number 2, I can get to by using my up-down arrow keys. If I'm on Edit Objects and I use my arrow keys, it will scroll me through all the available objects in the scene. And I can see down here under Selected Item that it shows me all the different objects. So I'll go to plate number 2. I could simply also use the pop-up menu. I'll move it into position. Now I want two more plates. Well, instead of loading two more plates, I can actually clone this plate. And by cloning the plate, it's already going to be parented to the table. So I don't have to go in, load the object, reparent, load the object, parent. If I simply go to the Objects panel and say clone this plate two more times because I want two more plates, now I have exact copies of this object, including any of their parenting or any of the other characteristics that I have assigned to this plate. Now I can simply say, let's grab plate number 3, move it over here, and grab plate number 4, and move it over here. I could have moved these plates numerically across the table so they would have been exactly in the same position on either side of the table. But again, if I'm trying to simulate reality, in reality, my plates aren't exactly spaced on my table. If I go around the table and I lay the plates down, they're randomly placed around the table, which in essence is what I've just done here, is I've gone around and I've placed my plates down manually on my table. Now I want to load up a fork. So let's go back to our camera view, keyboard of 6, and let's load the fork. And the fork comes in at 0, 0, 0 down here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to parent it to the table right away. Parent to the table. There it is right there. Now I can go back to my top view and zoom in a little bit. I can see that it's kind of sunk underneath the table. And that's probably because the forks probably went a little bit under the ground plane in the modeler when I made it. Let me go to my side view and zoom in a little bit. Now I've got a little problem here. One of my plates is in the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the fork to where I can see it. Let's bring it. Let's go to our top view. Let's move it to here. Go back to our side view. Now I can see the fork and try and position it on the table. Well, I'm going to zoom way in. Move this up. And the thing about the fork is I just can't lay it flat down on the table because it's curved like this. It wouldn't be sitting with this part of the fork up in the air. This would be resting and this would kind of lean back. So I need to do that. I need to rotate the object. So I'm going to want to rotate the object on its pitch. I'll turn off heading and bank. This allows me to rotate the object just on this axis. So now I can kind of rotate it back, take a look at it, go to move, move it down a little bit, and uh-oh, I'm moving this fork in really, really big steps. And again, that's because my grid size is set a little bit too big for the move I'm trying to accomplish here. Let me turn the grid size down, let's say to 20 centimeters. And you'll notice that I zoomed way in. All I need to do is zoom my view back out again. And now when I move the fork, I can move it in smaller increments. Well, that's even maybe a little bit too big, but if I zoom in here, another thing to notice is I only have one light in the scene right now, and that's the default distant light that comes into the scene. I can rotate that distant light, edit light, rotate, just to get a better view of what I'm working on. That looks a little bit better. Now I'll go back to the object, move, and I can try and position the fork so that it's laying on the table. And I can see I'm just a little bit off. I need to rotate it back just a little bit further. About like that, and then move it down. And now it's resting on the table. Now I don't want to move it on the y-axis anymore, so I'll turn the y-axis off, and I can only move it on the x and z axis. Let's go to our top view, and let's zoom back out. And there's my fork. So we'll move this up a little bit. And this fork is going to go with this plate number 1. So let's move it into position. Again, I can only move on X and Z here. I don't have to worry about going up or down, moving through the table, and I can put it into position. Now, I want to clone it. Again, I want to re-emphasize the fact that if I select the table at this point, and I move the table, that everything moves with the table because it's all parented to the table. Let me go back to the fork and clone it. I need 3 more forks to go around to my 3 other place settings. So let's clone the object 3 times. Again, all 3 of these will automatically be set, rotated on the table just how they should be, and parented to the table, ready to go. Saves me a lot of work. They all are in the exact same spot. It looks like I still only have 1 fork, but if I look at my selected item down here, I have 4 forks. They're all in the identical spot. So let's choose fork number 2. Now I need to put that over here and have it going this way, so I need to rotate it around 90 degrees on its heading. So let's go to Rotate, turn off Pitch, and turn on Heading. And instead of trying to move it manually, which I could, I can do it numerically by either clicking on the numeric button or hitting the N on the keyboard, N being my keyboard shortcut for bringing up the numeric panel. In here, I can say I want to rotate this fork 90 degrees on its heading. And we can see that that fork has rotated. Now I'll go to Move and move it into position. I'll go to fork number 3. Now fork number 3 I need to rotate 180 degrees, but let's say I'm not too good at math and I can't figure out that 180 is 90 twice. Well, if I go into the numeric panel, I can type in 90. Now I know I want to rotate it another 90 degrees. So I can simply put plus another 90. And the requester does the math for me. Basically, it allows me to do mathematical calculations from within the requester. Let's go ahead and do that. I can see the fork is now upside down. Let's go to Move. We'll move this one into position over here. We'll go to fork number 4. Rotate numeric. 90 plus 90 plus 90 gives me 270. And let's go to Move and move this into position here. Now, I can do the same thing with the spoon and the knife. It would be the same procedure. Load the first one up, parent it, position it, get its rotation right so it's sitting on the table, and then clone it 3 times and spread them around. Let me go back to my camera view. And again, I can grab the table. Let's move the table over here so we get a little bit better view of it. And I'm ready to save this scene. To save this scene, I go to the File Requester and say Save Scene As. This allows me to name the scene. If I'm working on a scene, so if I save this scene as, let's say, table 1.lws. Now if I make a change to it, if I move the table over to here, and I just want to resave the scene with the table over there, I can simply now just save the scene, and it's going to overwrite the last scene that I saved. So do I want to overwrite table 1? Yes, I do. Now when I load the scene, the table will come in over in this position. Let me go ahead and load up a scene of the table being completely set. Okay, so what I have here is the table set, but everything looks weird. Why is that? Well, I'm displaying these objects in bounding box format. If I go to the scene editor, from within the scene editor, I can display objects in different formats. And right now, the room is being displayed as a solid shaded preview, and it's got a little T on it, which says it will also show a texture map if there's a texture map on it. All the rest of these are just shown as squares next to them. This means bounding box. Now let's talk about the table. The table can be shown as a bounding box. It can be shown as points only. So now I can see the points that make up the table, but not the table itself. It can be shown as partial wireframe, a full wireframe, so I can see all of it, even the top of the table and the polygons that are making up underneath the table. Front face wireframe only shows me the polygons that the camera can see. It doesn't show me any of the polygons back behind or underneath the table that I can't see. Partial color shaded solid preview, full solid shaded preview, and solid shaded preview with texture. Now if I want to see everything, I have these 2 pop-up menus right here. Show allows me to show all of the objects, either as a bounding box, points only, wireframe, full wireframe, front face, partial solid, full solid, or texture solid. I can also say I want to see all the bones in the scene or all the lights in the scene. Well, I'm going to say I want to see all of my objects as textured solids. Now you can see they all have solid boxes with T's on them. And when I close the panel down, I can see all of the objects. The reason I might want to display objects in different formats like that is when I get a very complex scene going on, sometimes screen redraws take a little while. So if I move one object from one place to another, I have to wait for the screen to redraw to actually see what's going on if I'm trying to see everything in color, shaded, textured preview mode. So if you'll notice, even on my machine, as I move the table around, I'll select the table that everything is, again, parented to. As I move the table around, it moves around pretty well. But remember, I have a pretty good OpenGL accelerator card in this machine. But it's still not moving around as flawlessly as it moves around if I show everything as a bounding box. Now I can move it around in real time. There's no jerkiness to the movement. This gets accentuated as more objects get loaded into the screen, and Lightwave has to take into account where all the polygons are and redraw that each time I make any single move. Another nice thing to do is go in and set certain things up. I'll go in and say, well, I want to see the room as a color shaded, and I want to see the table as a color shaded. But I can use everything else as bounding boxes. Now, I can still see them and notice that the table moves around much nicer, but I still get a representation of what's on the table. If I want to see a little bit more detail on, say, the plates, I could go back in and let's make the plates all front-face wireframe. Now I can physically see the polygons making up the plates. I can still move this around very, very easily without any jitteriness, and I have a real good representation of the objects in the scene. So, depending upon how much complexity you have going on the scene, you may want to display the objects in different views while you're setting it up. Maybe once I get it set up, then I can say, okay, what's it really look like in full color shaded preview? And I go to my scene editor and say, show everything as a textured solid. And now I can see what it looks like. Another trick you can use for manipulating objects in real time is you can adjust your point polygon bounding box threshold. It's located under the options panel, and I talked about it in a quick start tape where when you move an object it turns into a bounding box, and then when you stop it comes back. That actually can be a desirable thing. Right now my point polygon threshold is set to 50,000. So as long as there are less than 50,000 polygons in the entire scene, everything is going to show as a color preview. Let me go ahead and change this down to 1,000. Now what I've told it is, it's only going to show me 1,000 polygons as my color shaded previews. Now let's close the panel, and as I move the table around, you'll see that only 1,000 of the polygons in the scene stay visible. Everything else turns into a bounding box. But I can move it very smoothly and very easily. When I let go, everything comes back. If you want to see everything all the time, you must set this number to be larger than the number of polygons that exist in the scene. Again, I'm going to take a little bit of a performance hit by being able to see everything in full color shaded preview at all times. Now I have the table set up with all of the place settings on the table, and each is an individual object that has been individually placed, so I can animate each individual object. If I come into this scene, I can grab one of the spoons. Actually, let me move around and grab the spoon right here, and I can say I want to move it, and I can move it up and down by itself. I could also move the plates, the knife, the fork, and the table, but if I move the table, everything else will move with it. But what if the table is just going to be sitting over in the corner, set, but it's never going to move? Nothing on it's going to move. The camera's just going to kind of travel past it. We want it to be sitting there in the kitchen. I don't have to take the time to set all of these place settings and set it over there because it can all just be one object. How do I do that? Well, if I go back to the modeler, and first I'm going to load the table. So we'll go to Load Object, and we'll load up the table. Now again, it's sitting so that it's just underneath the ground plane. If I want it to load in properly, I want to go ahead and hit T for move, hold down the Control key to constrain it to an axis. Let's put it so it's sitting on the ground plane. That looks good. Now let's set the table. I'm going to go to a different layer, bring the table up in the background layer, and I'm going to load a plate. The plate comes in down here, so let's go ahead and zoom in first of all a little bit. I'll hit the G key with the cursor here, and it will center that for me, and zoom in a little bit more. Let's hit the T key for move, and the control key to constrain it to an axis, and move this up so it's sitting on the table. Put the cursor here and hit the G key and zoom in, make sure it's actually on the table. There we go. Hit the A key to back out. And now I'm going to move it down here, so I'm going to hold down the control key to constrain it to an axis. Move it to here. Now instead of loading more plates and having to manipulate those plates like I did in layout, I can use some of my modeling tools like the mirror tool. The mirror tool, since this table is directly on 0, 0, 0, I can lay down this mirror axis right on the x-axis. There's another plate. Now we'll use another trick. We'll select the polygons that make up those plates, and we will copy them with the C keyboard equivalent. We will paste them right back where they are with the V equivalent, but I still have the original plate selected. So now I can hit the Y key for rotate. I'll put my cursor right in the center, hold down control key to constrain me to 15-degree increments, and I can put those plates right into position. If I bring those two layers together, I can see that I have the plates on the table and it all moves around as one object. Now I can continue with the next layer with the knife. So I'll bring the table up in the background, load up the knife. Again, do the same thing. We move it up onto the table. I would zoom in on it and rotate it into position like I had to when I was in the layout, because the knife isn't going to sit flat on the table. It's going to have to just be rotated just probably a little bit like that, and then back to move and move it down, sit it on the table. Hit the A key. I can bring the plates into the background so I can see where they are, and then move the knife into position. Now I can again duplicate this knife. Now the problem is I can't just mirror it at this point, so I am going to have to take this knife, rotate it around, move it into position like I did in the layout. But I was able to mirror the plates because their rotation doesn't really matter. Once I get this whole thing set up, what I end up with is an object that looks like this. And I even went as far as adding the chairs. This is all now in one layer as one object. And it all moves around as one object. Now again, this is if I'm going to have this in a scene and nothing on the table is actually going to move. Okay? Once I have this object set up, I'm going to go back over to layout, and let's just clear our scene. I'm going to load my room up. Okay, there's the room. Let's take our camera, move the camera back into position here. Let's change our grid size again. Let's go down to 50 centimeters. Okay, here's my camera. Let's look through the camera view and rotate the camera around, see that corner of the room again. Now I'm going to load the object called table set, which is the entire table. Here it is. Now it was modeled so its axis is a little underneath, but all I need to do is move it up. And again, the whole object is now going to move. Nothing is parented together here. This is all one object, considered to be one object. Again, I might want to go to my side view to make sure that it's sitting on the ground plane. That looks pretty good. Go back to my camera view. Now I can turn off Y because I don't want to move it up and down, and I can move it to wherever I want it to be in the room, and the whole thing moves as one object. But what if I'm in a situation where I'm going to have this table setting, and I do want to be able to animate the plate, the knife, the fork, all the things that are on the table individually as objects, but I'm going to use this table setup in several different scenes. Do I have to go in and set it up each time I go into a new scene? No, you don't. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to load up the scene called table set, and this is the scene where I set everything up originally, if you remember. So I can move the knife and the fork and the plate. Everything is its own individual object, all parented to the table. Grab the table, move the table around, everything moves with it. Grab a spoon, and I can move the spoon around as well as an independent object. Let's put that back where it was. What I can do here is I can go ahead and get rid of the room. I'm going to select the room as my current object and clear it. So the only thing I have left in the scene now is the table, the knives, the forks, the spoons, but everything is set up, everything is parented, everything is ready to go. And I'll save this as a scene. I'll say save scene as, and I might put a extension on it like LFS, so I remember that I'm going to use this for a load from scene. Okay? This scene is never going to be used by itself as an actual scene. It's used as a template so that I can now load all of these objects already put together and parented into another existing scene. So I've saved this out as table LFS. Now I can clear the whole scene, and let's load my room back in. Start with the room, change this, and now I'll go to the Objects panel, and instead of loading an object, I can load from scene. And I will load this, and it will ask me, do I want to load the lights from the scene as well? This is very important because I could also use this to say I have an aircraft and it's got a couple of lights on its wings that I'm using for lens flares that are blinking on and off. Well, if I have them parented to the plane and they're blinking, when I load from scene, I can also load those lights in from scene, and I'll have the blinking lights on the wing of the plane as well as any child-parent relationship objects that are there. But I'm just going to say no because I don't really have any other lights from the scene that I want to load. Now, when I go back into the scene, I have my table. It's all set. If I grab the table itself and move it around, everything is parented to it and it works. And I can grab individual objects like plates, and I can also move the plates around and animate them individually. So instead of having to set that up every time, set it up as its own individual scene and use that scene as a template, now I can load that table setting already set up into any scene that I want to use in Lightwave. Okay, now I've got the table loaded in, all set, ready to go. I'm going to grab the table object, which everything is parented to. Let's just move it into the center of the room. And I am ready to start setting up a camera move here to actually create an animation. Now, there are several ways that you can create animation. I could move the objects and record that, or I can move the camera. So that's what I'm going to do in this animation, is I'm going to move the camera around the table, panning around the table. So I can do that a couple of different ways. First of all, I'm going to say I want to edit the camera, and I could create manual keyframes. I could say, now, I want you to also understand that I have, under the Options panel, Auto Key Adjust and Auto Key Create turned on, which means wherever I have this positioned, if I move the slider, I automatically get a keyframe made there. If I move the slider and move the object, a key is automatically created wherever I move the object. Well, I'm going to be moving the camera, and it works the same way. So I'm on frame 0, so I position the camera where I want it to be at frame 0. Camera move, let's go to our camera view so we can see what the camera sees. And let's move the camera in, up a little bit, and then rotate it down. And I'll say at frame 0, I want it to look like this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make the table OpenGL so we get a better idea of what we're looking at here. There we go. So at frame 0, my camera is going to be here. Now I can drag my time slider out, let's say to frame 20. At frame 20, I want to move the camera over to here and rotate it back around onto the table. Now I just want to preview that one move I just made. So I'm going to set my first frame at 1 and my last frame at 20. And when I hit the playback button, I can see that camera move. And it's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted the camera to kind of pan around the table, but keeping the table pretty much centered in the shot the whole time. So instead of trying to manually set up keyframes and have the camera pointed where I want it to be pointed, what I can do is I can target the camera. So if I'm on the camera and I click on Target, just like parenting, it gives me a pop-up menu with all the available items, and I can target the camera at any item. Well, I'm going to target it to the table, and it's always good to remember that when you target something at an object, you're targeting it at the object's pivot point, not at the center of the object. So if the pivot point happens to be on the end of an object, if I target the camera at that object, the camera center is going to be pointed at the end of the object because that's where its pivot point is. For me, the pivot point of the table is right in the center of the table, so I'm okay. Now when I play back that same animation, you can see that the table stays centered in the shot for me, and it's a much better looking shot. So now it's a very easy thing for me to go ahead and change this back up to 60 frames. So at frame 20, I'm here, and I can use these buttons, the double arrows that point towards a plus, to get to the next or the previous keyframe. So I'm going to move out now to frame 40, let's say, and move the camera move, over to here. And you'll notice now, wherever I move the camera, it doesn't matter. The camera is automatically going to point at the table. So let's move it over here, and then say at frame 60, I want to go ahead and move the camera over to here. When I hit play, I now get a nice pan around the table, with the table centered in the shot the entire time. Now this is a little bit of a dizzying shot, but I set this up to illustrate the point of targeting. Now if I have this animation set and I'm ready to start rendering, of course I recommend doing test frames. I might come through here at 20 frame increments. I'll look at frame 20 and I'll hit F9. And I can see what the shot looks like at frame 20. You'll notice that it looks a whole lot like my OpenGL preview. So in a case like this, I'm not really seeing a whole lot of difference, but I haven't really surfaced any of these objects or lit the scene very well. And when we get into that in one of the tapes later on in the series, you'll see that it's going to make a big difference between what you see in your color-shaded solid preview and what you actually see when you hit the render button. But still, I want to check my motion path and make sure everything looks right, so I'll go to the next keyframe and hit F9 and so on. And I don't even have to check on the keyframes. I can check any in-between frame just by moving the slider to the frame that I want to preview. Maybe I want to preview frame 31, hit F9, and it will show me frame 31. So I can get a good idea of what's going on. Once I'm happy with it, I'm ready to save the animation. And I can save the animation a couple of different ways. Before I save the animation, there's a couple things I want to consider. I want to go to the camera panel, and I want to consider what resolution am I going to set the camera for. You have several different resolutions to choose from, and medium resolution is what's set up for video. Medium resolution is what I use most of the time. If I was going to be putting something out to print, I might go to high resolution or even maximum resolution. Most of the time for video, medium resolution works well. Now there are a lot of other variables in here, but I'm only going to talk about a few of them, and one of them is anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing will take the jaggies away from an object. So if we render this, and we look at it, we can see that we have jaggies around the edge of the table, we have jaggies going down the edges of the legs, and so forth. If I go back to my camera panel, and I turn anti-aliasing onto enhanced low, and I do another sample, it's going to take a little bit longer to render. It's going to render in increments. It does each pass 5 times. And again, when I'm rendering in medium resolution, it defaults to splitting the screen into 4 different segments to render, and it renders it in 4 segments. So we can see here, I no longer have the jaggies. And depending upon the object and how clean I need it to be, I can continue to bump anti-aliasing up. If I want that scene to render in one pass, one other thing I can change within my camera panel is my segment memory. And if I look right now, I can see that it's telling me it's going to render in 4 segments. Well, if you have enough RAM in your machine, you can go ahead and increase the segment memory so that the entire frame renders in 1 segment, and it will render faster. So if I go into my segment memory and I change this number, say to 8 million, now I can see that it's going to render the whole thing in 1 segment, and when I hit F9, it doesn't render in segments anymore. It's 1 big segment. And I'll have a little bit of time saving. And there we go. So I'm ready to render the animation. I go to the render panel, now that I'm happy with my camera settings. And I need to, first of all, tell it whether or not I want to trace shadows, trace reflections, or trace refractions. These are your ray tracing options. And for right now, I'm going to leave them turned off. Down here is where I can tell it if I want to save an animation or if I want to save RGB images or an image sequence. If I'm saving an animation, within Windows, I can save it out as an AVI. I can save it out as a flick file. I can save it out as a storyboard, and a storyboard will break my animation into segments and render 9 frames of my animation showing me a storyboard of how it looks, just like you would manually draw out a storyboard of a commercial or a video that you were going to shoot. If you're on the Macintosh platform, you can render out QuickTime movies. So let's go ahead and tell it that we want to save an animation. And first it's asking me, where do I want to save the animation to? Well, for now, I'll just go ahead and put it in the new tech directory, but if you're making AVIs, I would recommend making a directory for those AVIs and saving them in there. So I'm just going to call this table.avi. If I'm making an AVI animation, I want to always make sure that I put .avi on the end of my file name. Now it knows where to save it and what name to save it under, but it doesn't know what to save it as. I need to give it an animation type. I'll go ahead and call it a NewTek AVI, and what this will do is it will allow me to choose from any of the compression codecs that are loaded onto my machine. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. If I'm all set to render here, I click on Begin Rendering. Now it allows me to choose from any of the compression codecs loaded on my machine. So I choose the compression codec that I want. Each compression codec has some variables that you can play with here as far as quality. And then I would click OK, and it would render my animation. Now, it's going to start rendering the animation, and I can go off and do what I want to do and come back, and my animation should be done. So it renders through, and here's my first frame. Now it'll render the second frame. Wait a minute, it's not doing anything. Well, there's a reason for that. Within this panel, there's a button called Automatic Frame Advance. If you do not activate Automatic Frame Advance, it's going to wait for a mouse click in between each frame that is rendered. Automatic Frame Advance will make it automatically advance through those frames. This used to be a big button that would come up in the older versions of Lightwave when I would hit the render button, and it would pretty much stare me in the face, and I would always remember to push it. Now, it's among this panel, and it's a little more subtle, and sometimes I even forget to do it. And I will go to lunch and come back, and I've only rendered 1 frame. So the way to get around that is you can adjust your config file, the Lightwave configuration file, so that that button is always on. It's not a problem if it's on. If I go to begin rendering and it renders through and then it starts rendering the next frame and I don't want that, I can escape out of it. But if I hit render and I think it's going to render and I go away, when I come back, I've only got 1 frame. So a couple of other things I would want to do when I'm actually going to render the animation are I would want to turn off Show Rendering in Progress because I've already done my test frames. I know the way it looks. I don't want the machine to have to take the extra time to show me the rendering. That's going to make my rendering times higher if that's turned on. And I also don't want to see a full window display of each frame, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this off as well. Now let me show you how to adjust the config file. One thing that you want to remember if you're going to adjust the config file of Lightwave is to shut Lightwave down first. Because if I don't, if I go in and I change the config file and I save it, Lightwave is still running. Then I shut Lightwave down. Lightwave will rewrite its current configuration as the config file. It rewrites a config file every time you shut it down. So it would rewrite the old one right over top of the new one that I saved. So you want to make sure that you shut Lightwave down first. And I'm just going to shut the modeler down as well. Now I'm going to go into Explorer, and I'm going to look in the new tech directory, under Programs, and I have the lw.cfg or config file. Now you can use pretty much any text editor to open this file. I'm going to use the basic word processor that comes with Windows WordPad, and it will open the config file for me, and here it is. Once in the config file, I can set all of the defaults for Lightwave, and there's also a config file for the modeler as well. Now in Lightwave, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, if we scroll down here, here's my default segment memory that I was talking about, and it defaults to 22. Well, if I have enough RAM in the machine to bump it up to 8 million so that it's going to render in 1 segment for me all the time, I can physically change that right here. Let's just make that 8 million. Then, a little further down, we have Auto Frame Advance, and it's set to 0. Well, 0 is off, 1 is on. So I simply change this number to the number 1. Auto Frame Advance 1. Once I've done that, I save this file, back over top of itself, and then start Lightwave again. You'll notice, once I'm back in here, that my segment memory is automatically set to 8 million for me, so I'm going to render things in one segment, and under the render panel, automatic frame advance is turned on for me from the get-go. If I want to render out an image sequence, or a sequence of images instead of some kind of flick file or AVI, something along those lines, I would come down here and I would say I want to save RGB images, and I can even save alpha images. So I would say save RGB images, tell it where I want to save those images to. Then over here I can pick what file format I want to save the images as, and Lightwave comes with a very robust file format architecture where I can save as almost any file format that I would want. Also, I can choose different output extensions, either just numbers with an extension after it like JPEG or TIFF, a 4-digit number, or a 4-digit number with an extension after it. Okay, let's take a look at these animations. Here's the animation playing back as a medium res AVI. One of the things that you might run into with playing back medium res AVIs is they may play back kind of chunky, not in real time, because we're still having to throw up big images at 30 frames per second. Here's that same animation rendered at low res, 320 by 240, and it should play back a lot closer to real time. Most of the time when I'm making AVIs, I'm using them as a preview device anyway, so low res is fine. Now here's the animation rendered out as an image sequence, individual frames. Then those frames were taken into a digital disk recorder, which can compile those frames and play them back as 24-bit video in real time. This, of course, gives you the best look. Okay, now we've set up some basic camera moves, and I've shown you how to create and render an animation. Let's take a look at how to create some more complex movements in Lightwave. And I'm going to load up the Bug Off logo. Here it is. Let's go to our camera view, number 6 on my alphanumeric keyboard, and I can see the Bug Off logo. Now I want to create a bouncing motion. I want to have this logo bouncing up and down. So to do that, again, I'm going to see that Auto Key Adjust, Auto Key Creator turned on. At frame 0, I want it to be sitting here. I can hit the F key to go to a frame, so I'll go to frame 20. At frame 20, I want to move the logo up to here, and then I'll go to frame 40, and I can hit the reset button, which will bring it back to where it was originally, where it snapped into the scene. Seeing as how that's where I created my key at 0, it takes it back to the same spot where I had a key at 0. So now I have a 40-frame animation of one bounce. I'm going to change my preview length to 40 frames and play this back as an OpenGL preview. And you'll see that even with a good OpenGL card, this is still kind of bogged down. This is not playing in real time. So if I want to get a better idea of what it actually looks like, I can create a preview. Go to the Preview pop-up menu and say Make Preview. Frame 1 to 40. I'm going to do a wireframe preview. First it creates the preview. Then it brings up my playback controls. This will play back as close to real time as the machine can get. We can see that I have a bouncing motion here, but I can make it look better than this. So let's end our preview. And let's take a look at the motion graph for this object. I get to the motion graph by clicking on Graph Editor, or I can hit the M key on the keyboard for motion graph. Once I'm in the Graph Editor, I can adjust what's called the tension, continuity, and bias of the curve that I've created. And even though the object is just going straight up and straight down, Lightwave still treats it as a curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the velocity of the object. I can look at the X, the Y, and the Z positions. I can look at all the angles, and I can look at the scale of the object in the motion graph and the velocity. So the velocity of the object I can see over time. Here are my current frames. Here's the velocity of the object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the tension of the first frame by holding down the T key to a -1. Now, tension, continuity, and bias can only be a number between -1 and +1. And the way that tension works is, if I have an object, I have a keyframe here, and a keyframe here. If I put a tension of 1 on this keyframe, it's going to cause the object to slow down and actually stop on that keyframe, and then speed up slowly until it gets back to normal speed as it goes away. This is basically a red light, tension of 1. Tension of -1 is a yellow light, because it's going to cause that object to begin to speed up, speed through that keyframe, and then slow back down as it gets to the other side. Well, for my bouncing motion here, as it comes down, I want it to speed up as it approaches the ground, and then be fast and then slow down as it gets further away. So when I start out at 0 and when I end up at 40, if I put -1 on both of those, it'll speed up and slow down as it approaches the ground each time. So let's go ahead and look at keyframe 40. Hold down the T key and make that a tension of -1 as well. I've taken these values off my screen. I can click on the Auto Limits button to bring it back into perspective. Let's go ahead and use this motion and create another preview. Now when I loop this, I have a much nicer bouncing motion because, again, as it starts to approach the ground, it speeds up, and then it takes off fast off the ground and begins to slow down as it gets back up towards that middle keyframe. Now, I'm playing this back, looping the animation. The animation is only 40 frames. What if I want it to continue to bounce throughout my entire animation? I can go back into the motion graph, M on the keyboard, and I have a pop-up menu called End Behavior. And End Behavior, I can either have it cycle through once and stop, I can have it cycle through once and reset, or I can have it repeat the cycle over and over again for the entire length of the animation. I'm going to turn repeat on, tell it to use that motion, and I'm going to change my animation to 120 frames. Let's make a preview. And even though I only created 3 keyframes, 0, 20, and 40, the logo will continue to bounce throughout the entire length of the animation because I've told it to repeat. There we go. Now, what if I want it to bounce a few times and then stop? I don't want it to repeat throughout the entire animation. Repeat is great. Repeat is nice if I'm trying to set up any kind of repeating cycle, like maybe a wheel spinning. If I set up a car and I make a wheel, I can tell that wheel between frame 1 and 10 spin 360 degrees and repeat. Then every 10 frames, my wheel spins around once for the entire length of the animation. The propeller on a plane, the cycle of a light blinking on and off. I want the light to blink the whole time, so I set up a little flash cycle and it blinks the whole time. But if I want it to only blink a few times, or in this case, I only want it to bounce a few times and then stop, I can use another technique of cutting and pasting my keyframes. So let's go back into the motion graph. I want to look at the Y position, and here's my bounce, bouncing 1 time. Now I want it to bounce 4 times. So in order to do that, I need to copy all these frames. So I'm starting at 0 and ending at 40. If I click on Copy Paste Keys, where do I want to start? Well, I want to start at 0. Where do I want to end? I want to end at 40. It automatically defaults to the length of whatever you've got in there. And I want to paste them at frame 41. Well, now I've got this bounce, but I've got 2 frames here. So to solve this problem, what I'm going to do is select this keyframe and delete it. And I deleted it by hitting the delete key. And now, this is okay, but these frames here, since it pasted at 41, they're both 1 frame off. I need to move both of these back 1 frame. Well, instead of manually moving them back, I can go to Shift Keys. My low frame is going to be 60. My high frame is going to be 81. And I want to shift them by -1. And both of these keyframes have now shifted back 1. So now I have 2 bounces. I want 2 more, I can just copy and paste this whole thing. Copy it. Do I want to copy the whole thing? Yes, I do. I need to, again, get rid of this keyframe. I can click on delete, and just by clicking on that keyframe, it deletes. Now I need to shift all of these keys back. So we go to Shift Keys, and again, I've got 20, 60, start at frame 100. And shift them by -1. And all those frames shift back. So now I've got 4 bounces with no repeat turned on. I need to make my preview longer. I'll go ahead and make it 180 frames. And let's make the preview. So let's play this preview back, and something doesn't look quite right. We can see that I lost my really nice bouncing motion that I had in there. It appears that I have it on the first frame, and when it stops, it appears that I have it on the last frame, but I'm not getting it on those frames in between. Well, let's take a look at our motion graph. And when I'm only dealing with 3 keyframes, tension works fine because I could have it on the first and the last keyframe. But when I added all my extra keyframes, if we look at our Y position here, I didn't get it on the in-between frames. So what I need to do is adjust the continuity. And the continuity adjusts how it reacts, how Lightwave reacts to a curve in between points. With 3 keyframes, tension on the end ones is fine. When I put frames in between, Lightwave tries to smoothly interpolate those extra frames that I've added. So what I need to do is go back in and change the continuity at the low spots of my Y-axis here. So I can hit S is the keyboard shortcut to get to my spline controls. I could enter a continuity of -1 here, or I can click on the frame and hold down the C on the keyboard, C for continuity, and drag to -1. Now I get those nice sharp curves. Let's go ahead and use that, create another preview. And now I get the nice bouncing motion even on the in-between frames. So there's my 4 bounces, and it stops. Okay, so now I've got my logo bouncing up and down 4 times and then stopping instead of repeatedly bouncing throughout the entire length of the animation. What if I now want to make it bounce in towards the camera? Well, I could create a keyframe here, one here, one here, one here, one here, but I've already got keyframes set on this to go up and down, and it's all set to go. Another way to approach this is to use a null object. A null object is an object that doesn't render in Lightwave. If I come into the Object Add pop-up, one of my options is Add a Null Object. And when I do, this gets added to the scene. It's represented by a little asterisk or star. It will never render, and I use this as a controller object. So as we were talking about parenting before, what I can do is I can parent the logo. Let's choose the bug-off logo and say we want to parent it to the null object. Now, if I select the null object, when I move the null object, the bug-off logo moves with it. But the bug-off logo still has the motion of going up and down that we put on it. So what I can do is I can move the null object back to here, go to the last frame, 160, and let's just make our preview 160 long. At 160, I'm going to move the null object up to here. So at frame 0, the null object starts back here. By frame 160, it's up here. The bug-off logo will give me my bouncing motion path as it approaches the camera now. Okay, one of the things that I don't like about the way this looks if I'm actually going to use it as a flying logo is the way it kind of smacks into place there at the end, because I still have that tension of -1 on the last keyframe, which is causing it to speed up as it approaches the keyframe, but then it just stops. So what I'm going to do is, on the bug-off logo itself, at that last keyframe at 60, I'm going to go to my spline tension control, and I'm going to make it a tension of 1, which is going to cause it to slow down as it approaches that keyframe. Let's take a look at this. Okay, let's take a look at this same animation from our side view. I'll use my move gadget here and my zoom gadget so we can see the entire motion path. There it is. And again, as the object moves through, we can see that our continuity is set right, so we're going to get our bounces. And then at the end here, we get our little ease in and stop. Now if I want to change this motion path, I just need to change the motion path of the null object. So let's take a look. I'm going to go, let's say, to frame 20, and I'm going to move the null object over here. Then I'm going to go to frame 40. I'm going to move the null object over to there. And frame 60, and we'll move it over here. And frame 80, we'll move it over here. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So in essence, what I'm trying to say here is, now, wherever I move the null object, the logo is going to move, and I'm going to still have my bouncing motion. And not only is it going to react to how I move the null object, but if I rotate the null object, I'm now also rotating the object that it's parented to. So I could say, back at this keyframe here, it's in this orientation rotational-wise. By the time I get to this keyframe here, I want to rotate my null object around one time. Now, instead of having to make this whole preview and watch it again, I'm just going to make the preview from frame 60 to 160. Well, I only made it spin once. Why is it spinning around twice? At this keyframe, I told it from this keyframe to be spun around one time, but I never changed this last keyframe, and at this keyframe it knows that it was supposed to be in its proper orientation. So from here to here it flipped over where I told it to, and then from here to here it flipped back to its original position again. Now, I wanted you to understand that if I rotated the null object, that the object itself that was parented to it would rotate around it, but made the animation a little bit wacky. So let's go ahead and restore the animation. I can go back to the keyframe where I told it to rotate, hit the numeric, and I can see that I have rotated it 359.7 degrees. Well, I just make that back to 0. Now it has no rotation, and we're back to where we were. The logo is now bouncing with no rotation. Now, if I want to make this just a little bit more visually appealing, I can apply one of my favorite plugins. It's very easy to use, and it's called Lazy Points. And what Lazy Points does is, it looks at the object and it looks at its pivot point. And the pivot point of the object moves at its normal speed wherever I keyframe it, but the rest of the points in the object, say this is my object and here's my pivot point, the pivot point moves, the rest of them kind of lag behind. And then when it stops, they catch up, hence the name Lazy Points. So let's go to the Bug Off logo. I need to go to the Objects panel, because this is a displacement map plugin. We are actually displacing the polygons of the object. There are some surface attributes that make an object look as though it's bumpy or has a bumpy appearance to it, but it's a visual shader that makes it appear that way. A displacement map physically moves the polygons and displaces the object or manipulates the object itself. So I'm going to use the displacement map plugin called Lazy Points and simply make a preview. Okay, let's take a look at this preview. I still had preview set from 60 to 160, so we only really see half of it. But you can see how the pivot point, which is right here in the center, is moving at its normal speed, and the rest of the logo is a little bit lagging behind. Kind of makes it look rubbery or maybe a little gelatinous. Another thing to remember with Lazy Points is when the pivot point gets to the end point, the rest of them are still kind of lagging behind. Now, in this case, it looks kind of cool. I would call that a happy mistake, and I might go ahead and keep it like that because the logo doesn't look bad. But if I wanted it to finish out, I would make the preview go beyond the last keyframe to give the object enough time for the points to catch up. I can also adjust the amount of lag that it has. If we go back into the Displacement Map plugin, and it's got options for Lazy Points, I can adjust the lag rate. Right now it's at 2.5. I'm going to go ahead and make it more of a lag rate. Let's make it 4.5. And again, if I want it to finish out, I can see that my last frame there is 160. Let's go ahead and make our preview to 180. Okay, now let's take a look at this final preview. There it is. Now that I'm happy with that, let's go ahead and render it out and take a look at what it looks like rendered. Okay, here we can see our logo coming towards the camera, bouncing along our defined motion path, and lazy points acting on it, so I get that squishy look. One thing you always want to remember with lazy points is you want to make sure your object has a lot of subdivisions in it so that it has room to bend and deform. All right, let's take a look at what we can do with a null object and some lights. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add some lights to this scene. I now have 4 lights in the scene. I want them all to be spotlights. So we'll make them spots. So I have 4 spotlights in the scene now, and I'm going to go to each spotlight, edit lights. Light number 4, if I hit reset, it's right in the center. I'm just going to make sure that all my lights are reset to the center. There's light number 3 is already there. Light number 2 is now reset for me here, and then light number 1. So all my lights are in the same. Now I can also reset for rotation. If I go to rotate and hit reset, it will reset on its rotation for me. So I have all 4 lights. They're all spotlights in the same spot. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a null object. So I go to Objects, Add Null. There it is. And I'm going to parent all of my lights to that null object. So edit light number 1. We want to parent to the null. Light number 2. Again, I can use my up-down arrow keys to scroll through my objects or lights. So let's parent that to the null. Light number 3, we'll parent that to the null. And light number 4, we'll parent that to the null. So now, if I grab the null object and I move the null object around, I'm moving all 4 lights around. Now I'm going to position the lights. I'm going to go to my top view and edit the lights, move. Light number 1 I'm going to put over here. That's actually light number 4. Light number 3 I'm going to put over here. Light number 2 I'm going to put over here. And light number 1 I'm going to put over here. Then I'm going to go to my side view. Now light number 1 I'm going to put up here. And light number 4 I'm going to put right here. Light number 3 I'm going to put down here. And light number 2 down here. So what I've created here is a spiral of lights. They're staggered from the top view and from the side view. And they're all parented to my null object. Again, if I grab the null object and I move the null object around, I move all of those lights. Let's take a look at this from our camera view, and let's back our camera up. Grab the camera, back up so we can see all of the lights. With the null object again, I can move the lights around. So what I'm going to do now is create a very simple animation for this null object. At frame 0, I want the null object to be up off the screen so all of the lights are off the screen. At frame 60, I'm going to hit reset to bring that null object back down to where all the lights are on the screen. So now with this animation, I have these 4 lights coming down into the picture. Now what I'm going to do is, at frame 60, not only do I want it to come down to here, but I also want it to rotate. I'll go into my numeric panel and on the keyboard, let's say 720 degrees, 2 full rotations on its heading. Now when we look at it, we can see that I have a spiral of lights coming down into the scene. Another interesting thing about lights and null objects is that if I size or stretch the null object, I'm going to size it, and if I make it smaller, it will actually draw the lights towards it. If I size the null object to make it bigger, it will spread the lights further apart. So this would be a way to have all these lights come in and collide, maybe into one big lens flare, or have them start out as a small cluster coming down together, and when they get to the end, all just separate off into the distance. One thing also to keep in mind, though, is it only works this way if I have lights parented to it. If I have objects parented to a null object, if I size the null object, I'm also sizing the object. So this trick doesn't work with objects, but it works great with lights. Here we can see my lights spiraling down into the scene, I've given them all lens flares, and then at the end of the animation they all come together in the center by sizing the null object. Up to this point, we've been talking about animating an object as a whole for the most part. Now I want to talk about animating the object itself without physically moving the object. Like we did with lazy points using a displacement map, you can use other types of displacement maps on objects to animate them within themselves. So let's go ahead and load up the bug off logo again. Here it is. And if I go to the Objects panel, under Deformations, we have a Displacement Map button. When I push it, I get my requester for doing displacement maps. Now, displacement maps can be done with images. Let's say I want to make a landscape. I could take the topographical image of a landscape and put it down onto a poly map. And wherever I have dark areas in the image, it'll stay low. Wherever I have light areas in the image, it'll pop it up. It will displace that into a terrain for me. But we also have what are called procedural maps. And a procedural map is an algorithm. And some of these procedural maps include ripples and fractal bumps. Well, I'm going to go ahead and use ripples. And I'm going to use one of Lightwave 5.5's new feature called a texture reference object. So I'm going to add a reference object for my ripples. And I can see here my texture amplitude, how many different wave sources I have. Well, I just want to get a very subtle ripple, so I'm going to change this to 1 wave source instead of 3. And I'll leave the rest of the variables as they are. Let's come out and take a look, and whoa! The object looks pretty messed up. And if I go ahead and hit play, we can see that it's rippling there within itself. But it's rippling to where the texture reference object is. I have the reference object right in the middle. So if I move the reference object off to the side, we'll see that the logo starts to come back into shape somewhat, but I think I've got my ripples set a little bit too big. So what I can do to change that is I can size the null object. And as I size the null object, I can size the ripples. Now the ripples are starting to come down and starting to get a little bit more reasonable. Now when I hit play, we can see that I have this nice big subtle ripple coming through my object. Now I can change the amount that I have here by going back into the Objects Displacement Map and changing the texture amplitude. Right now it's set to 0.5. I'm going to set it to 0.1. And now you see I have much less of that ripple going on, but it's still the very subtle ripple that I wanted. And if I look at this from the camera view, I get a nice wavy logo, which is what I was trying to achieve. Again, I can change this now by sizing the null object, reference object. Let's go ahead and size that back down and take a look. And that's basically what I was looking for right there. Again, at this point, I can animate the logo itself. At frame 0, I want to grab the logo, kind of move it off into the distance. And then, let's say by frame 30, I want it to be back up here, and then just waver for another minute or another second. So as we watch this now, let's take it back to the beginning. It wavers as it's coming towards us, and then it kind of sits here and wavers back and forth. Of course, it smacked into place here at the end, but we already know how to fix that. We go to that keyframe, we go to the spline controls, and we give it a tension of 1. Now when it comes up, you'll see it kind of eases into position for me instead of smacking into place, and I get my wavering that I was looking for. Now, let's say that I want it to come up to the camera and I want it to sit there and waver for a little while, and then I want it to slowly vanish right in front of my eyes. How can I do that? I can do that by using Object Dissolve. If I go back to the Objects panel and I go to Appearance Options, I can see in here that I have an Object Dissolve window. Now if I just type in 100% here, it's just going to make the object invisible the whole time. So in order to make the object slowly fade out, I need to use an envelope. And any of the variables in Lightwave that have an E next to them, the E stands for envelope. Now when I come in here, you're going to see it looks a lot like the motion graph does, and it works the same way as setting up the motion graph works, although we only have one channel. In the motion graph, we had velocity, and we had our positions and our rotations. In an envelope, you have one channel. It's either going to be this much of an intensity on, this much of an intensity off, and keyframes in between making those intensities ramp up and down. So if I go back out real quick and I look at my animation, we come up to here at frame 60. It's been warbling. Now between frame 60 and frame 90, I want it to slowly vanish over that 1 second. So I'm going to go ahead and make my preview 90 frames long. Go back into Objects panel. Go to Object Dissolve Envelope. And right now I've got one keyframe at 0, and it's 0% dissolved, so it's completely visible. I want it to stay completely visible all the way to frame 60, so I'll create a key at frame 60. I can hit the Enter key to bring up my Create Key requester, and I'll type in 60 and hit Enter again. Now I have a keyframe at frame 60. Now between frame 60 and 90, I want it to ramp up, so I need another keyframe at frame 90. Hit the Enter key, type in 90, and hit Enter again. I now have a keyframe at 0, one at 60, and one at 90. So at frame 0, I want it to be 0% as its current value, not dissolved at all. At frame 60, I want it to be 0%, not dissolved at all. Between frame 60 and 90, I want it to go to 100% dissolved. But you'll notice that when I do this, anytime I have 3 points in the Lightwave interface, it's trying to make a spline out of them. It's trying to make a nice smooth transition between those 3 points. But this is causing this to dip down into the negative. And this is undesirable. It's not always an undesirable thing, but if I'm trying to create an envelope for a light, and the light dips down into the negative spectrum, in Lightwave 5.5 you can have a negative light, which actually would subtract light from my scene, and I might not want that. So in order to fix this, I can go to this keyframe at frame 60, go to my spline controls, and I can make it linear. This is going to cause it to be a straight line between the keyframe before it and its keyframe. Now, it's 0% dissolved from 0 to 60, and from 60 to 90, it slowly dissolves out. How can I test to see if this actually worked? Well, I can run the preview, but the preview doesn't really show me transparency. It doesn't show me that it's disappearing. So I need to do some test frames. I'm going to go to the Render panel, make sure that I have Show Render in Progress turned on so I can see what I'm going to render. And I'll render frame 60, F9. And I can see the logo. It's not dissolved at all. Now I'm going to look at frame 70, F9. And I can see that the logo is starting to dissolve slowly. With the black background, it's a little bit more difficult to tell. But let's go ahead up to frame 80. Now you can definitely tell that it's starting to dissolve. And then by frame 90, it should be completely gone. And it is 100% gone. So I'm getting that slow dissolve between frames 60 to 90. Again, like in a motion graph, when I'm working with an envelope, I can shift my keys just like I did. I can copy and paste my keys. Let's say I want to have a light blinking on and off. I could create 0% intensity at frame 0, 100% intensity at frame 2, and 0% intensity at frame 4, and then put end behavior as repeat. Now that is going to give me a 4-frame flash throughout the entire length of the animation. Let's go ahead and take a look at this animation and see what it looks like rendered. You can see here's the animation coming in with the wavering. Gets up to the front, and then while it's wavering, it slowly dissolves out. Okay, now I want to take this animation that I've created. I like the motion of the object and it looks good, but one thing that I discovered early on in doing animation is doing animation over solid color backgrounds can be pretty boring. So in order to spruce this animation up a little bit, I want to add something in the background. Now I could create objects in Lightwave to add in the background, but a much easier and quicker way to get a very interesting background is to use an image. So to load an image into Lightwave so it can be used, we need to go to the Images panel, and we click on the Load Image button. And I'm going to load up an image that was created in Lightwave, just some colored spotlights, and we've got some stars going on back here. And I'm going to go to the Effects panel, and within the Effects panel, I have a Compositing tab. Here I can load in background images, so I'm going to load in my image as my background and close the panel. Now let's just render this, F9, and see what it looks like. You can now see that I'm using this image for the background. It looks a whole lot more interesting than it looked when it was on a plain black background. And at the end of the animation, when it's up here, if you remember, this dissolves completely out. So what if I want it to slowly dissolve in, waver, and then dissolve out? We could adjust the envelope for the dissolve so that the object would dissolve in and dissolve out. But there's another way that we can do it. We can use fog. To use fog, I'm going to go to the effects panel, and I'm going to turn on fog. And what I'm going to do is turn on backdrop fog. And this is going to cause the fog to take on the color of whatever my background is. So we're not going to really see the fog because I have this image, and the fog is going to be the same color as the image. But as the object passes through the fog, it's going to dissolve in as it comes through the fog. Now, how do we decide where it dissolves in and how fast it dissolves in? Well, I'm going to go to the options panel here real quick, and I'm going to turn on show fog radius. I can look at my object from the top view, and my grid is set to 1 meter, and we can change the grid size by using the closed and open bracket keys. But I'm going to set my grid so that it's 1 meter, so that I can count off and see how far away it is. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I had a little bit in the beginning here, so let's call it 8 meters is how far away it is. So I'll go back to my fog, and I'll tell the fog that its maximum fog distance is 8 meters. And when I do this, because I have show fog radius on, we can see the radius of the fog. And as long as the object is outside the radius of the fog, it is going to be completely dissolved out. I'm not going to see it at all. Now, how do I dissolve when it's going to come in? That's my minimum distance. And I'm going to make it about half the distance of my maximum, so that at about the halfway point, it starts to dissolve, or it's fully dissolved in. So we'll go back to the effects panel, and we'll make minimum distance 4. Now, if we go back and we do some test frames, I can see that at frame 1, it is dissolved out. It's back there in the fog, and I can't see it at all. And as we start to come in, it's now starting to come through the fog, and we're starting to see it. And as I get all the way up to the front here, it is completely dissolved back in. Now, the interesting thing about doing it this way is that it's using the distance from the camera. So what if I had 4 or 5 objects that I wanted to bring in, and I wanted them all to be dissolving in as they were coming into the scene? Instead of having to go and set up dissolve envelopes for each one of those individual objects, I could set the fog up like this, and then I just need to bring the objects in, and as they get within that distance of the camera, they will begin to dissolve in automatically for me. Another thing that I can do to get a better representation of what I'm working with in OpenGL is I can go to the options panel, and I can turn on layout background. Right now is set to blank. Well, I can tell it to show me the background image, and then it will show me the image that I have loaded in as my background, and I can get a much better idea of what this animation is really going to look like. Let's take a look at the rendered animation now. We can see that it's wavering and slowly dissolving in. Gets to that minimum fog distance, it's fully in, wavers a little bit at the end, and then dissolves out for us. And it looks a whole lot nicer now because we have that background image in there. Okay, now we've learned how we can displace the object, but what if I want to have a little bit more control over how I'm displacing the object? The displacement maps that I've shown you up to this point displace all of the points within the object. What if I only want to displace a portion of the points, and I want to displace them in a very accurate manner? In that case, I would use a morph. So in order to use a morph, I need to create an anchor or an original object, and then change that object, and that is my morph target. Let's go over into the modeler, take a closer look at how this is done. I'm going to load up one of the objects that comes with Lightwave. It's called the Fat Pyre. Here he is. And this is a MetaNurbs object. It's not polygons yet. I could not load this object as it sits into the layout. I need to freeze it first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this object. I'm going to hit C on the keyboard to copy it. I'm going to go to my second layer and paste him in there with V. So now I have the same thing in layer 1 and layer 2. Now my original object is still saved on my hard drive, so I have that as my original copy if I want to come back and modify it again. What I'm going to do now is my original object in layer 1, I'm going to go ahead and freeze it. Control D on the keyboard is the keyboard equivalent for freezing an object. Now I'm going to go to the second object, and I'm going to modify him slightly. And what I'm trying to do is I want to make him look like he's breathing. So I'm going to grab the polygons that make up his chest and his lower chest, his upper abdomen. Deselect these. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to use a tool called Smooth Scale. And Smooth Scale will move all of these polygons out without deforming them. I've got a 2-meter grid here. That's pretty big. I'm going to move these out, say, 50 millimeters. Okay, they didn't really come out that far. And if you look at my OpenGL preview, as I undo and redo, you can see how much they came out. Well, that's not quite enough, so I'm going to do my smooth scale again. This time, let's do 100 millimeters. Okay, and that came out pretty much. Now, again, if I look at layer 1, his chest is in like that. Layer 2, his chest sticks out a little bit. So let's go ahead and freeze this object, Control D. Now, one thing that I want you to realize about metanerbs is, if I have an object that's made out of metanerbs, and I freeze it, it has a certain number of points in a certain point order. If I then take that same metanerbed object and I modify it by pulling the nerbs and making the changes in the object, as long as I don't add any extra geometry to it, when I freeze it, it will have the same exact number of points in the same point order. And this is what I need in order to do a morph. Both objects, the original and my target, have to have the same number of points in the same point order. Now I've got two objects that fit that description, so let's go ahead and save them. Layer number 1, I'll save object as, and I'll call him Pyre1. Then I'll go to layer number 2, and I'll save this object as Pyre2. So now I've got my two objects. Let's go ahead and put both of them into the layout. I'll go to layer number 1, and I'll say I want to put this object, Pyre1. Then I'll go to layer number 2, and I'll say I want to put another new object as Pyre2. When I get over to layout, I have both objects in the exact same position. Let's go to our camera view, number 6 on the alphanumeric keypad, and I have both objects in the same position. Now when I'm going to do a morph, one of my objects is my object that is going to morph. The other one is the morph target. The morph target I want to either get out of the shot by moving it out of the camera's range, or use object dissolve and dissolve it out 100% because I don't ever want to actually see it. So I'm going to go into the objects panel, and I'm going to take Pyre number 2, the one with the expanded chest. That's my morph target. Him, I'm going to make 100% dissolved. So I will never see him. I'm now going to go to Pyre number 1, and under deformations is where I can do my morphs. So Pyre number 1 is my current object. I want to select a morph target for it, and it will let me select from any of the objects that are loaded in the scene. That's why I had to load Pyre number 2 into the scene, because my target has to also be loaded in the scene. So let's select Pyre number 2 as my target, and just like with the dissolve, if I type in 100% under morph amount, it's just going to be 100% morphed. I need it to happen over time. I need his chest to expand and contract, so I can use an envelope. So let's go into the morph amount envelope, and let's see, I'm going to have his lungs expand and contract every 20 frames. So I'm going to create a key at frame 10, and I'm going to create a key at frame 20. And I'm going to say at frame 0, 0% morphed. At frame 10, I want it to be 100% morphed. And then back down again to frame 20, 0% morphed. Now, let's go ahead out and take a look at this. Now we can see his lungs expand one time and contract over 20 frames. Now I want him to continue to breathe. I want him to breathe over and over again. So we can use that same technique that we used making the logo hop. I can go back into my morph, and I can turn on repeat. Now, we can see him breathing, but it doesn't look real accurate. Maybe if he just got done running a couple miles, but he's breathing in and out, and there's no resting in between his breaths. Usually when someone respirates, they'll... and there's that resting point in between. So let's go back to our envelope here, and I'm going to create another key. This is the key at 20. I'm going to create another key at 25. And at 25, I still want it to be 0% morphed. And again, I want this to be a straight line, so I go into spline controls and make it linear. Now, I can turn on repeat. I need to make sure that my morph target is set, and it now gives me a realistic breathing motion. We can see that I have my breathing motion happening over and over and over again because I have repeat turned on. Well, now that we've made it through the first two tapes, you've got a good idea of the basics of Lightwave, but don't miss the rest of the series where we're going to get into surfacing objects, camera, lighting our scenes, and many more advanced modeling and animation techniques with Lightwave. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.